before we hang up, can I ask you a question or two?
Yeah, of course.
If you got a minute.
Yeah.
So you've been doing this for a long time. You're probably doing this longer than me. So what's your view? How do you see all of this stuff? And yeah. So what's your view? How do you see all of this stuff? And yeah.
Oh my God. Well, I see again one issue for me, because I'm always trying to look at this in the from the context of how it relates to policy.
Right.
Is timescales.
Yeah.
I did a lot of reporting recently on the sensitivity question, and there's there's a substantial amount of work by serious folks that's kind of nibbling at the lower end of the range of warming from a doubled CO2 concentration. And of course, no one can presume that we're going to stop it doubling. But even there, you talk about timescale. How fast? To me, the more important question than the sensitivity is the transient. How warm will it get by 2100, 2150?
Yeah.
There's still substantial uncertainty, and that I think some people have kind of tried to downplay that real uncertainty there, as opposed to
in the sensitivity.
Well, that sense, or the transient.
Just
warming.
the rate, yeah.
How much warming is possible by 2100. In the interest of trying to grab people's attention,
right.
those higher end scenarios get pushed a lot, and I think in the long run, it's not productive. And so I've written about that, and some people, activist types, and some climate scientists aren't happy about that. But I just try to follow the data.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been writing about this, as you say, since the 1980s. My first articles about the human relationship with climate were on nuclear winter. 1985. I posted this piece on, and it was using this at that time very crude models of aerosols and what that would do if there was a big war. And then 1988, my first long piece on global warming. So I have been at this a long time, and I would like to say, oh, the picture is just so much clearer now. But when I look back at my 1988 piece in my 1992 global warming book, and I look at projections for sea level rise and warming today, and they're really essentially the same, with similar levels of question marks. So I think that says to me, and actually Ken Caldera and other scientists have said the same thing to me. We knew what we need to know decades ago.
Right.
And we some of it entails uncertainty, but it's kind of like the picture has not really changed. I mean, there are clarifications, like with your work.
Sure.
But they still leave these question marks, like we were just saying about, short time scale rates of change and stuff. So that's kind of where I'm at on the basic science. And I did a graph I showed on .earth of the stuff we know really well. I graphed like a bell curve. It's a steep curve. Like CO2 is a greenhouse gas.
Right.
There's hardly any variation. It's not even a curve. It's just a little peak like this. But rate of sea level rise is kind of like this. There's a wide distribution of ideas still in science, and there's durable uncertainty. The sensitivity question is very similar. It's like still you've got serious scientists engaged from different perspectives who say, well, it could be this, it could be this. And then you get into the biggest variable of all is human behavior.
Sure.
Will China keep spewing CO2 at the rate it is? Probably for a while, but probably not for much longer. Because
you don't think so?
Well, as the country gets wealthier, less poor, the chances are this initial movement toward constraints on pollution will intensify. Coal is still, coal is the big animal in the room. But
as they get wealthier, are they not going to be generating more carbon?
Well, for a while, but then you get this curve, the Kuznets curve, which is this. We went through the same thing. London had its epic smog, and then in 1952, the same as Beijing had this year, and then you have this transition toward more controls and more efficiency, more efficient use of energy, which we're way ahead of China on.
Yeah.
So I'm not optimistic in the long run. I mean, we're in for a lot of climate change.
Yeah.
But we're also this ridiculously resilient, adaptable species. I don't see this as a civilization-ending thing. I see it as an end to the norms that that I grew up with, I mean, you're younger than me, so even your norms are different than my norms.
Sure.
And my sons, for them, the Arctic is, when I was growing up, the Arctic was this untouched, forbidden place where all these old white explorers went and froze to death.
Mm-hmm.
And for my sons, the Arctic is a place where polar bears are having a hard time, and it's warming, and there's going to be ships there. So you get that kind of shifting sense of what's normal, and that's going to play into how this plays out as well. I think I gave you more than you asked for.
No, you didn't. It's always really interesting talking to people and hearing. So you've been doing this as long as Bill McKibben, and I'm sure you guys have chatted plenty.
Yeah.
But you have a sort of different sound about your view a little bit than he does.
We do, and I think that relates to this reality that we have to get used to. That I think there's been a lot of focus on the idea that everything that's a dispute related to global warming is manufactured. That it's all Exxon's fault through some pernicious funding. But when you look at detail, you can get reasonable people can disagree very, very starkly on either the state of the climate science or certainly on the question of what do you do about it. And I did a piece on .earth right after the Fukushima disaster, where Bill McKibben and George Monbiot, who's a very active environmental writer in England. He's kind of the Bill McKibben of England.
Okay.
They both wrote columns for The Guardian the same day, right after the nuclear disaster. Yeah. And they're both essentially built their writing careers around climate change. Mm-hmm. And Bill said that the Fukushima disaster proved that nuclear power was not a solution, that it's too brittle, it's too dangerous. And George Monbiot said it proves that it's robust and that's what we need to do. Because even the worst earthquake in the history of earthquakes, with the worst disaster on a stupidly designed plant, didn't result in an epic release of radiation. So that says to me, if these two guys who are equally worried about global warming can have completely divergent reactions to a nuclear accident, that says we should get comfortable with a variegated array of views going forward.
Sure.
And Bill and I have very different views.
Yeah. So, I guess personal question from you is, what's your view on sort of the debate or the question on the role of scientists in all of this? How do you see that? Because I'm at that point where I'm like, geez, I'm just getting going, and how much do you talk about, and what do you say, and what don't you? And I'm,
this is not a one size fits all.
No, it's not.
Situation. Jim Hansen. I taught a course at Bard College a few years ago, just as like a guest seminar.
Yeah. For
one spring on communication and environmental policy, and I had them do an exercise. That was the year. It was when the IPCC report had come out, and Susan was the lead voice on Working Group 1, the basic science, and Jim Hansen that year was pushing really hard, getting arrested and stuff. So I split the class in two. These are young graduate students in environmental policy. I said, okay, you guys over here, you're Solomonites, and you over here, you're Hansenites.
Right.
So I want you to build a case, come into the room, and debate the merits of being an activist scientist or Susan, I don't know if you remember, but she was resistant. When she ran that IPCC report, she stood up there in 2007, and BBC reporter was badgering her at this press conference in Paris, saying, well, okay, so you've told us the science. Now, what do you feel about it as a person? They asked Susan. And she said, that's not my job. She literally, I think, if you look at her body language, I think she put her arms and came over.
Yeah, right.
We're giving you the information. You, society, have to figure out what to do about this.
Interesting.
And it was so utterly different than Jim's reaction.
Yeah.
And who's to say who's right or wrong? And I at the time, I wrote a profile of her at that time that got at her approach. Overall, I tend to be a Solomonite in the sense that we all have a job to do here. I'm a communicator.
Right.
But we're all human beings too. So, and what I do say, the one thing I say to scientists, especially young ones, is at the very least speak in two sentences. Mm. Too many people in this arena have spoken in run-on sentence where it's here's some new work on global warming and it's a real problem, and this is what you should do. Mm. Where they do the is and the ought. Mm-hmm. And this is Ken Caldera is a good person to ask about this because he told me once he got his undergraduate degree in philosophy, or he minored in philosophy. And he led me to David Hume's work, the philosopher, who says you can't get an ought from an is.
Yeah.
And so at least say, here, I'm a scientist, I work on this question, here's my science, period. I'm also a homeowner and and I have a family, and I worry about my kids. And personally, this is what I feel about what we should do with our energy policy. What gets people into hot water, I think, sometimes is when they conflate the two things in a way. And I think that ends up kicking back on the credibility of the science. Mm-hmm. And this has been true of the IPCC. It's been true of some scientists. I think it's been a challenge for Jim Hansen to retain scientific credibility and also do his activism, which I don't say he shouldn't be doing that. And he's very articulate and passionate and has chosen a course. And I can tell you there's no one in the world who's going to convince him to do something else. I've written about him since the 80s. And then, and Al Gore as well. He's done the is-ought mashup, and it's his choice. I'm not going to say he's wrong. And so that's kind of but I would say speak in two sentences.
Gotcha. It's good.